My name is Melissa Ziobro, and I am the Specialist Professor of Public History at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey. Today is September 30th, 2021. We are here today with Joe Colford for an interview to augment the exhibit, Monmouth County 9/11 and its Aftermath. This interview is being recorded with the permission of all participants. Joe, can you just confirm for me that you do indeed consent to the recording and that you understand that this interview will live in full in the public domain?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. So to start, just tell us a little bit about where and when were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Jersey City, and I've been a Middletown resident now for the last 40 years. I'm a recently retired psychologist. My PhD is in child clinical psychology, and I had a license and a part-time practice for a while. I first retired in 2003 after 26 years as a school psychologist. And then 2 years ago, I retired yet again after 17 years as a psychology professor and program director at Georgia Court University in Lakewood. And during the day of 9/11, I was a psychologist in a middle school in Milano and Aberdeen School District. And that obviously took up the rest of my day and many days after.
Tell us just briefly about your educational background.
I graduated from St. Peter's College in Jersey City with a degree in sociology. I then went to graduate school and obtained a state certificate as a school psychologist, returned to Seton Hall University, and completed my PhD in child clinical psychology.
Now we're bringing up to the month of September 2001. You were living in Middletown at this point, and you were working in the Matawan-Aberdeen School District.
Yes.
Of course, you can't talk about specifics, but what was your job like before 9/11? Because I imagine it changes greatly after 9/11, right? So before 9/11, tell us a little bit about your job.
My job as a school psychologist basically is multidimensional. We're there to provide services for children with special needs. We do a number of things. We assess for learning and other social, emotional, behavioral issues. We do a lot of crisis intervention and counseling, and just a lot of consultation with parents, school administrators, and school teachers. That changed significantly, however, as you can imagine, on 9/11.
So then let's bring it up to the day of September 11th. Was that going to be a quote-unquote regular work day for you?
Yes, I would report to the middle school, usually between 7:30, 7:45 in the morning. And my secretary was at a separate building, and she arrived like 8:30. So probably close to 9 o'clock, I would call her and say, okay, what's on the docket? What's the schedule for today? What's happening? And I did that. And she said, oh, by the way, we're here looking at a plane flew into one of the Twin Towers. Now, I thought nothing of it. I thought it was a two-seater, you know, which happened back in, like I said, 30s in the Empire State Building. I thought nothing of it until a few minutes went by and there was a TV on in the teacher's room, and that's when it hit hard that this was a major event.
And something I keep pointing out to my students is we didn't all carry a computer in our pocket, right? So you weren't getting immediate alerts on your phone what was going on. You had to hear from your secretary. You had to find a TV. They were not everywhere. Right.
And of course, no one had iPhones at that time. So the only means of access to that information was a TV in the teacher's room. So when people just get a snippet of information, they tend to create a whole fiction about what's happening. So that was what we had to deal with the rest of that day.
And how did the day then unfold? Did the children in your district stay in class all day?
Well, it's interesting. Best practices is for kids to stay in school because they're around familiar routines. They don't go home and obsess over the scenes on TV 24/7 and grieve with their families during the school hours. So I basically was in the front office for a better part of the day as parents came to pick their children up, and I'd say, you know what, it's really best practice based upon my national organization that I'm a member of, that kids stay here because they're around familiar people, a routine, and you could deal with all those other issues when they leave here at 2:30, 3 o'clock. But almost to a person, parents took their kids anyway, and I understand that, so we couldn't stop that from happening, even though it wasn't the best practice. And the first part of my day, after the news got out about the attacks, I really suspended anything I had on my schedule, and I made myself available to all the teachers and students throughout the day who wanted to talk about it. Because one of my interests, the graduate courses I created at Georgian Court was school crisis prevention and intervention. And an interest of mine is how we talk to kids about tragedy and crises. So I tried to put those skills to good use and to debrief a lot of kids who had some concerns about what was happening, and particularly 3 different teachers whose husbands were working in the general area. But that was my day, just to make myself available to do that kind of thing.
I had just jotted down to ask you if you knew of any children under your care or employees who had loved ones in peril.
There was one boy who lost a parent, a father, that day. The 3 teachers I talked to, we took out of class and sat down in the principal's office, in my office, and said, "Are you okay? Do you want to stay? Do you want to go home?" And to a person, the 3 of them said, "No, I want to stay." And then never one was very powerful. She says, "No, I know he's okay. I could feel it. I know he's okay, and I want to go back to class." I said, "That's great." Yeah. And the people I knew, 9/11, or not even through my job as a school psychologist, but rather as a commissioner of basketball for the Middletown Youth Athletic Association, oddly enough.
Because you yourself knew a lot of people who were in the vicinity of Ground Zero, correct?
Yes.
Okay. In fact, you were very personally impacted by 9/11. You wrote to me about Paulnimbly, one of the victims, who was your friend and neighbor. Can you tell us about Paul?
Sure. Paul, I had been in my neighborhood for about 17 years when Paul moved in. And we were both, he was a very active runner, and I was a kind of a sometimes runner. And we were running in the race before the Haskell at Monmouth Racetrack. And after the race was over, he came up to me and introduced himself. And he said, "You know, my name's Paulnimbly. I'm into girls basketball. If ever you need help running a program, let me know." I said, "That's great." Now, I was commissioner of basketball, but we had no separate girls program because there were 2 other active girls programs in Middletown. I only had 2 girls sign up, but we put them on boys' teams. Finally, the 2 other programs folded. So I knew Paul was the one who would be the next commissioner of basketball, but also to start out as a commissioner of the girls program. So I went to Paul and I asked him to start a girls program. He was ecstatic. And he had a big following. He and his 2 girls are very involved in basketball. And year-round, he would take them up in the off-season to a place in the Edison area, to a gym where they'd get training, get drills, and all kind of stuff. And he had 2 or 3 very, very devoted assistant coaches. So when I asked him to start a girls program, he was ecstatic. And the first year, we had 300 girls enrolled. And eventually, in fact, Paul told me, he died at the age of 42. He said he wanted to retire at the age of 45 and build a facility or rent a facility and just devote it year-round to girls training for basketball. So anyway, very successful girls program. And after 6 years of my being commissioner, I decided to step down. I went to Paul and I said, "Listen, Paul, what do you think? Do you want to be commissioner?" He was equally as ecstatic about that. He was very excited. So I notified the other commissioners. I said, "Listen, I'm going to retire. And I'll go to the meeting with Paul. I'll bring him. You'll meet him. I'll hand my letter of resignation and with a recommendation that Paul be appointed my successor as commissioner." And we did that. We got together one night, and I remember driving to it was Bodmin Park in Middletown. It was torrential rain that night. And after the meeting was over, we went back out. The rain had stopped. And I handed over lots of paperwork to Paul. But the one thing I forgot was the checkbook and all the financial records. So I said to Paul, "Listen, I'm going to be at the gym tomorrow night. Can you stop by?" He said, "Well, depends on what Sherry," his wife, would say, because we're planning to move. My house is in boxes, and I have a 6-month-old son at home named Michael. That night was September 10th. The next day, you know what happened. So that's how I first got to know Paul. Great guy. His girls loved him. I went to his funeral, and John Deeney, who's quoted in the article in the Washington Post that I left, was the coach who had to take over for him. And he got up to do the eulogy twice and cried like a baby, couldn't get through it. It was really very touching. That's the kind of guy Paul was. He had a great following. Everyone thought he was terrific.
And did you say he worked for Cantor Fitzgerald?
Yes, he worked with Cantor Fitzgerald.
Did Paul's family and friends ever find out anything about his experience that day? Was he able to call home at any point? Or?
That I don't know. And I spent time with his wife, Sherry, after that. She never indicated that, so I really couldn't say.
I imagine it was hard to talk about. He seems like he was so passionate about girls basketball specifically. Do you know anything about that? Was it just because he had daughters and he wanted them?
He had daughters, yeah. And he was committed to really training them. And what was great about him as a coach is that he never blamed the girls for the loss of the game. In fact, his team was considered to be the championship contender for that season. And I missed the game because I worked my private practice that night. And I got to the gym after the game was over. I said, Paul, how'd you do? We lost. So that was a stunner. They were really upset by a team they should have beaten. What happened? And he took the blame on himself. I didn't make the right decisions. My coaches and I should have made substitutions. He never blamed the girls. And he never talked about the lack of a skill in a girl. He talked about them being in the developmental stage. That's the kind of guy he was.
And roughly how old were his children when he passed? You said a baby, 6 months?
6 months. He had 2 girls from his first marriage. So Jessica would have been like 10 to 13.
Okay, so
yeah,
roughly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you knew a lot of other victims as well. So as we discussed, I'm going to name each of them, and maybe you can just share some of your memories of them. So tell us about Joe Capriati.
Joe Capriati was a detective at the time, and I've known him for years. My 2 boys played, actually my younger son is same age as Joe's son, and my son played basketball. And Joe Capriati, the father, came to every game, even though his son didn't play. Every game, he was very faithful. And a couple of stories, actually. So the first night that, can I digress just for a second?
Please do.
The first night that Paul's team was going to gather again together after his death, I wanted to be there because, as I said, one part of my graduate work is how do we talk to kids about tragedy. And I wanted to make sure that the girls were okay. So I show up at the gym, and Joe Capriati apparently calls home and gets my wife. She says, "Where's Joe?" She says, "Joe's at the gym." And it turns out that Dale Russakoff, the author of the Washington Post article, had called town hall and said, "Listen, I want to talk to somebody." Word got out that Middletown had lost 37 people. That's outrageous. So I'm halfway into the Thorne Middle School gym in the parking lot, dark out. Joe's there with Dale Russakoff and says, "Joe, Dale wants to interview the girls about Paul." I said, "Well, that's great, but I have a dual interest here." I said, "Number one, I'm a licensed psychologist, and I can't give you permission to do that unless you get informed consent from the parents. And second of all, I'm the commissioner, and I don't want there any more disruptions in their routine than they already have with Paul's death." I said, "But feel free to sit through the practice. I'll sit through with you, and when the parents come to pick their girls up, you can, because they're all underage, you can get their permission." And sure enough, that happened. And I witnessed the interviews, and she was very soft and gentle and developmentally very appropriate in the questions she asked the kids and the way she responded to their answers. And what broke after that, then things really mushroomed. Washington Post front page story, Middletown's devastated. That gets viral, that's worldwide. And I can't tell the exact date, but one of the first games held, the girls' games held after Paul's death, was in the Thorne Middle School gym. And in one corner, with Klieg lights, was a BBC camera crew interviewing me and other people for a show over the BBC. The other side of the gym was a 60 minutes version on Japanese TV. There was a Japanese camera crew there. I'll never forget the man who did the interviewed me and other people. The guy by the name of Dai Koyama, and he sent me 2 very nice handwritten letters after it, thanking me for access to the people in the gym and all that kind of stuff. And that same night, in the stands, was a reporter from the Baltimore Sun-Times. So things really went viral at that point. So you asked me about Joe.
Yeah,
Okay.
but no, let's stay on this thread because I did have a question on this later. There's this intense press interest in Middletown, which you experienced firsthand. Obviously, as a psychologist, as a professional, you allowed it as long as the parents consented. Did you hope that it would be cathartic for the kids, or how did your thinking go about whether or not that might traumatize them or provide some catharsis?
I guess that's what I wanted to keep an eye on. And I thought the interview process went very smoothly. Like I said, she was a very soft, gentle interviewer. When I first went there, I walked inside, and part of what the best practice do when you're talking to kids about crises, you shouldn't have an outsider do it. You should have people familiar to them do it. So even though the girls knew who I was, they didn't know me really well. And I walked into the gym with Dale Rusikoff that night, and the 3 assistant coaches were sitting around in a circle talking to the girls, and it went perfectly smoothly. It was really very wonderful, because Paul created a very broad support network for his girls, with gyms, with other coaches, and with parents who are very supportive of their games and their practices and all that. So I thought it went very well. Had I thought the girls were upset, I might have stopped some of the interviews, but I thought it went very well.
Okay. And do you recall the date, or just generally how quickly the press started coming in and showing that interest?
Let me see. She wrote the article on the 24th of September. So I'm guessing the 17th or thereabouts. I'm just guessing.
And ballpark is fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go back then to the other victims that you knew. So Joe Capriati.
Yeah, and Joe, I don't know if you know, familiar with what must be the Memorial Gardens in Middletown. There's a special monument just erected recently in Joe's behalf. Joe died pancreatic cancer. They say he picked up while working at Ground Zero. While he was alive as a detective, he was the keeper of the list, they called him. And his job was to go around and notify families that they found body parts of their friends and family members. And I talked to him about that. He always took another cop with him. And he said people reacted differently. One woman started throwing furniture around the house. Another one just shut down and said, offered him a cup of tea and poured him a cup of tea at the kitchen table. But that was his job. He took it upon himself to do that. Even though, as far as I understand, the federal government took over that role about halfway through the recovery, but Joe still, he was the keeper of the list. He's the one that did that.
And Joe worked for Middletown Police,
detective.
Yeah. I love that you brought him up, because one of the things we've wanted to stress with the exhibit is that this still is with us. It's not 9/11 that day and then it's done, and we talk about the 147 lost, but there are many others like Joe who carried illnesses from the toxicity at Ground Zero. So I'm so glad you brought him up. Tell us just a little bit more about him as a person.
Just a good guy, very committed to the kids. I'll never forget, my son was played in the middle school team, and it was a championship game, and it was a nail biter. My son's team, Thorne's team, won the game, but the other team wasn't very happy, and the stands weren't very happy. So a big brawl broke out, and I'll never forget Joe, who was at the game because he always came to the games. I'll never forget him on the ground, lying on the ground, trying to break up 2 people who were fighting, and another woman holding a baby, kicking him in the back, saying, "Get off him, get off him, get off him."
What is wrong with people?
I know, but Joe was right in the thick of it, you know?
My goodness.
But soft-spoken, just a wonderful guy.
Aww. And Bob Parks.
Well, this is interesting, if I could connect him with Nick Patriotism. Bob Parks grew up in Jersey City. I'm sorry, born there, grew up in Bayonne. And was one of my coaches when I was commissioner. One of my coaches. Great guy, great sense of humor, smart guy, has an MBA. And in fact, once he told me that one year, it was the end of it, he wasn't going to coach anymore. The next year, I was down to coach. I called Bob. I said, "Bob, did you feel like coaching again?" "Not really." "Why, Joe? Do you need somebody?" I said, "Frankly, yes." He said, "Okay, I'll do it." So he did it. And Bob, before he earned his MBA, taught high school in a couple of schools. One of the schools was Hudson Catholic High School in Jersey City. One of his students was Paulnimbly.
Oh.
Okay, so keep that thought. Nick Patriotism was the brother of John Patriotism, one of my neighbors, lived 2 doors away from Paul. And Nick was profoundly deaf. I met him a number of times and communicated using a combination of sign, gestures, but never any formal deaf language. And he had a job apparently for many years. Whatever happened, the job fell through, so he needed to be employed. This is my thinking. And segue to Bob Parks for a second. Bob Parks was out of work for a while with an MBA, smart guy. And my thinking always was, I know Paul got Stephen Patriotism a job with Ken Fitzgerald with him. And I'm wondering whether or not his former teacher, Bob Parks, he got a job for as well.
Oh.
It's interesting how all those roads converge at one point. Always wondered about that.
So Bob Parks was at Cantor Fitzgerald?
Cantor Fitzgerald,
That's
yes.
awesome.
Yes.
Oh my
But
goodness.
what's interesting about Bob was a real iconoclast. He went his own way, didn't follow a lead. He knew what he wanted to do. And they also discovered his body right away, because it wasn't long after 9/11 when I went to the wake at Dave's funeral home in Red Bank. And I was talking to his sister. And his sister said to me, I said to my mother, they're going to find Bob's body because all the people are exiting through this particular door. He wasn't going to follow them. He was going to go his own way.
Oh, wow.
And that's why they probably found the body.
Wow.
Interesting.
You just referenced going to the wake. What was it like seeing all of those wakes and funerals in town? I mean, did it seem like they were constant, like they were everywhere, or did it
Oh
not
yeah,
feel that?
there's always some, and plus they were scattered far apart because I guess you had to wait till you had some kind of body part to identify. I don't know how that worked, but yeah, they were always all over the place. St. Mary's was filled with them. I guess 26 parishioners at St. Mary's were among the 37, something like that.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so we have just 2 more, I think, on the list that you had referenced. Mary Hunt Casey.
Yeah, actually it's Kathy Casey. It was my mistake.
Okay.
Kathy was the mother of a boy who played in, I coached a travel team, the senior travel team at the time of 9/11. No, I'm sorry, before 9/11. But the junior team had Matt Casey was on it. And Kathy Casey was Matt's mother. And she was always very, must have been a tough cookie because she had a high-ranking position in the financial aspect of another company in the towers. And for a woman to be able to accomplish that, she must have been quite competent. And she was always very much out there. Whenever I saw her, it was after a work day. She would have a big coat on, and she'd come up to me and ask me about the next practice, the next schedule, the season, when does it end, all that kind of stuff. And the father was kind of quiet and shy. So that's how I knew her. She was very much out there. And she died, and I heard later on, although I couldn't verify it, that the son, that Matt kind of blamed himself because when the mother went to drop him off at the bus stop to go to school, he said not to worry about it. I'll run to the bus stop and you can get to work. And I think part of his thinking was, had I delayed my mother, she would have missed that train, and she wouldn't. So that's the kind of guilt that I heard he experienced.
That's anecdotally, we hear this is what those who were left behind had to struggle with, and that is such a heavy burden.
Yeah, but the positive, if there was a positive out of this, is that the husband joined a grief group for other widows and widowers of 9/11 victims, and met and married one of the women he met there.
Yes, I do recall reading that story. Okay, the last one I had here was Peter Milano.
Peter, I also knew through basketball. Just a great guy. He had a knack of, whenever he had a conversation with you, he left you feeling good because he always had a compliment at the end of the conversation. And he's very generous. His son was on the team. I believe last year I coached the travel team. And we won the championship. We were 20-0. We didn't lose a game. And he would always buy us stuff during the season. Skip boards when kids checked into the game, they didn't slip on the floor. And after the season was over, won the championship, he offered to buy each of the kids out of his own pocket a championship jacket. That's the kind of guy he was. Now I understand they have since moved. Families were basically moved to Texas, and every year there's a Peter Milano golf outing for CBA to raise money for Catholic education because his son went to CBA.
Now is that everyone on your list?
Nick, Bob, Peter. Yep.
Okay. I mean, your basketball family was
Right.
enormously impacted. Did you ever think about canceling the season, or did you feel like you must continue to provide that normalcy for the kids?
No, absolutely normalcy. I believe that strongly. I teach in my graduate courses. You've got to maintain normalcy, routine. It's very reassuring to kids. Because if we had canceled the season, Paul's girls, who depended upon that every year for a good 3 or 4 months, would have been left in the void with nothing to fall back on that was reassuring to them. So definitely never considered doing that.
Yeah. And did most of the players continue with the season?
Yes.
They did.
I don't know of any who dropped out.
Oh, wow.
Did
the league offer any counseling to students who might want it, or kind of point them in the direction of services if they need it, or did you not think that was your place as a league?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I guess in terms of my role, I just wanted to make sure that they would be okay. So I visit that one night, and then in later games I attended. I thought that things were going as smoothly as they possibly could, given the circumstances. Now,
in your work life, did the schools close for a few days following 9/11, or were they open on the 12th? And
no, where I worked, we didn't close. Okay. We stayed open. But I think some leeway was given to families who wanted to keep their kids home for a day or two. I don't think that's best practices, like I said, but if that's a family's right to do that.
Okay. And did you see a lot of students seeking your support in the aftermath, or are the kids largely so young and resilient they just kind of went about their lives?
Well, it's interesting. The demographic of Middletown, Aberdeen was such that there were a lot of high flyers who worked in the World Trade Center, in the Twin Towers. So outside of the one boy who lost a father, there wasn't that much of a connection to that demographic, if you will, the financial demographic.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. Like I said, of everyone I talked to that next 1 or 2 days after 9/11, most were teachers who had spouses over there.
Okay. And the 3 teachers you referenced earlier whose spouses were there, did those spouses make it home?
Yes, they all did.
Now, you had kind of specialized in children and trauma. Did your field kind of change after 9/11 generally, with an increased cognizance of this, or in any way?
I think so. My field, it was always an interest of mine, not just counseling, but crisis counseling in the aftermath of things like this. And I think the field has really come to grips with that, because now we're talking about everything from immigration, people coming from traumatized backgrounds into this country for the first time, school shootings, which have subsided over time. So the field has really come full circle and said these, in fact, in part of our training to become a school psychologist, says you've got to have coursework in exactly how to manage those kinds of events.
Okay. And that had not been prerequisite before?
Not before, no.
Okay. Well, that's so interesting. Would you say that 9/11 changed you personally in any ways?
I think so. I mean, you go to work. A family member goes to work and doesn't come home. I think so. And I remember visiting Paul's wife, Sherry, a number of times, both during and immediately after 9/11. I remember sitting on the porch with her saying, Sherry, Paul's probably in a hospital bed somewhere. He hasn't been identified yet. I'm sure he's going to be fine. I did believe that at the time. So anyway, I kept in touch with her. And then about 6 or 8 months later, a mutual friend of ours, who's a school nurse, came to me and she said, I haven't seen Sherry in a while. Can you check in on her? I think she's depressed. I don't think she's gone out of the house for a while. So I went down to see Sherry. And I said, how you doing? She says, I haven't been out of the house in a long time. And she said, I said, does it ever happen to you before? And she was from Trinidad. She said, when I was an 18-year-old in Trinidad, I was in a car accident. She said, I wasn't hurt, but I was traumatized. I didn't leave the house for a year. I said, what was it at the end of the year that enabled you to leave your house? And she said, this is what I found so powerful. She says, because I went to church, because I realized in church there's nothing to fear. Think of that. So those kinds of memories, yeah, it does alter your perspective on things.
A lot of people, when they talk about the period immediately following 9/11, recall an intense patriotism that seemed to exist. Is that your recollection?
Yes. It's interesting. My older son was a freshman at Fairfield University. And we heard, this would have been a couple of days before 9/11, that he had mono. He was going to be in the infirmary on campus for a few days till the mono cleared. So we said, well, how about we just pick him up and bring him back? So he was home at 9/11. I returned him to university the Sunday after. And driving up the turnpike and the parkway and every other roadway getting back to Connecticut to drop him off at Fairfield, there were handmade signs on the fence, on the overhangs. God bless America. We love you, America. Hang in there, America. I mean, that was a pretty powerful ride back to Fairfield for me.
And what about any anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant backlash? Do you recall any of that in the air?
No, not in my neck of the woods.
Yeah. And what were your thoughts on the so-called global war on terrorism that follows 9/11?
Wow, that's a whole different interview. Well, I think there was a lot of backlash. I think there's a lot of underlying bigotry that probably was poked and prodded with the attacks on 9/11. And I think it's always important that you don't vilify a group of people because of the actions of a few. And that's what I always have preached in my coursework, that we can't assume that a group of people responsible for something that only a few were able to create.
Do you feel like we as a society have done an adequate job of remembering 9/11?
I think so. This past year, the 20th anniversary, yeah, I think there was a lot of attention paid in the media, with all reminiscences about the event. They still read the names of almost 3,000 people who died every year. So I'd like to think, yes, we do have, we have paid homage to them on an ongoing basis. Of course, nowadays we're hearing every day practically of people who died through ground zero related illnesses. So that's a whole other chapter in this book, basically.
And in your own words, why do you think we should remember 9/11?
Well, I think we should remember 9/11, at least in part, because of the sense of community it created in this country. You know, people died. It was a horrific event. But I know that blood banks refused to take blood donations anymore because they had so many donated they couldn't refrigerate them anywhere. So I think what came out of that tragedy was a sense of community, people helping each other. And I think that's what we have to stay with, get back to if we're not there anymore. So I think, yeah, the community response is what I found very powerful.
And speaking of illnesses related to Ground Zero, do you think there's enough awareness of that issue and support for that issue?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not quite sure. I know there's a lot of pushback about giving out too much money because how can we prove that that cancer, for example, is connected to Ground Zero? But you know what? I think we have to give this some slack. I mean, there are a lot of people who spend a lot of hours, a lot of days, a lot of months in the aftermath picking up the pieces, quite literally. And I think they'd have to be compensated in some way.
We're coming to the end of my prepared questions, but what do you want people listening to these oral history interviews someday to know about the impact that 9/11 had on Middletown?
I guess I go back to what I mentioned before, that I think the Middletown pulled together. I know I was in St. Mary's Parish, developed a crisis center where people would show up 24/7 and cry, talk, pray, whatever they were doing. And that was, in fact, Eileen Thiel, who started that, is also referenced in the book El Sheehy wrote. Was the one who first started. She's a nurse, and she had a good heart, and she figured that that's where people had to go. They needed a place to go to talk to people, to reminisce, to share memories. And I give her credit because she's just one of many people who pulled together to do all that. There were car washes where people donated lots of money for the 9/11 survivors. There were things that sprung up throughout the community that really was designed to do something about what happened. And I think that's that sense of community I mentioned before.
That's lovely. So is there anything else that you would like to add that we've not covered?
No, I think it's good to talk about that. You know, I think about these things a lot, especially with the 20th anniversary of late. No, it's good. I appreciate the opportunity to share this. I'm glad you reached out.
Okay, thank you so much.